of you, and corresponding greetings to those who are present with us from some another time zones. I'm Dr. Surbi Mathur, Senior Assistant Professor, Gujarat Forensic Sciences University, the only forensic university in the world. I'm happy to welcome you all on behalf of our Honorable Director General, our Director, my fellow organizing committee members, and also on my personal behalf to this third session of GFSU Webinar Series 2020. Friends, it has been said that a hero is someone who have given his life to something bigger than oneself. And today we have one such great hero, one such distinguished personality among us who has given his life for the development of forensic science, empowering criminal justice system, and passionately epitomizing the significance of forensics in crime investigations and delivery of justice. I take the opportunity to welcome our eminent speaker of today's webinar and a global famed forensic scientist, Mr. Barry A.J. Fisher. Barry A.J. Fisher served as a crime laboratory director for the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, a position he held from the year 1987 until his retirement in year 2009. He began his career in criminalistics with the Sheriff's Crime Lab in 1969 and worked in wide variety of assignments. His current interest concerns the interrelationship between forensic science and the law, along with the public policy issues concerning the timely delivery of quality forensic services to the criminal justice system. He served as a member of American Bar Association Criminal Justice Sections ad hoc committee to ensure the integrity of criminal process. Fisher is a member of many professional organizations. He is a distinguished fellow and a past president of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences and was awarded with the Academy's highest award, the Gradol Medallion. He served as a president of the International Association of Forensic Sciences, president of American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors, and a past chairman of American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors Laboratory Accreditation Board. He is the founding director and served on the board of directors of National Forensic Science Technology Center from year 1995 to 2007. Fisher has been a member of several editorial boards like the Journal of Forensic Sciences, the Journal of Forensic Identification, Forensic Science Policy and Management, Forensic Science Research, and the McGraw-Hill Encyclopedia of Science and Technology. Fisher is an alumni member of the Council of Scientific Society President and a life member of International Association of Chiefs of Police and was a member of IACP's Forensic Committee. His textbook, Techniques of Crime Scene Investigation, in its 8th edition, enjoys a wide popularity. He is a co-author of 2 other books named as Forensic Demystified and Introduction to Criminalistics, the Foundation of Forensic Science. Fisher speaks throughout the United States and has lectured in Canada, England, Australia, Singapore, France, Israel, Japan, China, Turkey, Dubai, and Portugal on forensic science laboratory practices, quality assurances, and related topics. Since retiring, Fisher has consulted for the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime, the United States Department of Justice International Criminal Investigative Training Program, and Analytic Services in
Just a minute,
not-for-profit
Surbi.
institute. Yeah.
Sorry for Mr. Paresh, please stop sharing. Ankita Tandon, madam, please off your microphones, please.
Yeah. So it is a not-for-profit institute that provides studies and analysis to aid decision makers in national security, homeland security, and public safety. He also consults on forensic science matters. Friends, his list of superlative credentials are long and unending, but highly inspirational, I must say. So instead, let me invite Barry himself to talk with us and enhance our understanding on today's webinar topic, that is crime scene reconstruction. Over to you, Mr. Fisher. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I hope I can live up to it and leave you with some useful information. I'm going to go over and start sharing my screen. And can you see my title slide?
Yes, sir. We can see your slide.
Very good. Okay. So I was asked to give a short lecture on crime scene reconstruction, and this is going to just be touching the very tip of the iceberg here, because there is a great deal of material to cover, and ideally you would want to have somebody come in and do a hands-on lecture with practicum and to explain how things are done. But I'm going to try my best to give you some information here. I like to think of crime scene reconstruction as part of crime scene investigation, but you might want to consider it as advanced crime scene investigation. So typically you go out to a crime scene, or somebody in the investigative process collects the various items of evidence and brings it to a forensic laboratory or a coroner medical examiner's office. And what we're trying to do here is to figure out, well, what does all of this stuff mean? Can we use it to tell a story, to explain what happens? So first of all, I'll say good morning to you, and thank you for inviting me here this morning. I'm speaking to you from California, out in this portion of the United States. I'm about 200 kilometers due east of Los Angeles, in a place called Indio. We're in the desert, and this is summertime, so it's pretty hot, and it's also today was around 45 degrees C, so you can get an idea of what we're looking at over here. So crime scene investigation is used to try to categorize how the crime was committed, how the crime occurred, and what might or might not have happened during the commission of the crime. The purpose is to try to ascertain the
Nitin Patel,
sequence.
sir, please off your microphones, please.
The purpose is to try to determine the sequence of events that occurred before, during, and after the crime occurred. Now, at the crime scene, you're sort of looking at a picture, a snapshot, if you will, of what happened at a particular time as the crime occurred, and now you're trying to fill in the blanks. It's important that the person conducting crime scene reconstruction has a fairly decent background in science, and logic is particularly important. And by logic, I'm talking about some common sense over here. And the person doing this has to be willing to change his mind as additional information comes in, so the initial conclusions no longer fit what he first or she first concluded. A little bit about me. You've already heard my background. I'm originally from New York City, which is the opposite side of the United States. Back in primary school and in high school, I knew I wanted to study science, and by the time I got to college, I uh, decided I wanted to study chemistry. I went on to graduate school and took a master's degree in organic chemistry. I suppose I would have gone on for PhD, except I met my wife back then on a blind date, and a marriage happened not long after that. When I moved out to Los Angeles, where my wife was living, I also went to school in the evening and took an MBA, a Master of Business Administration, and joined the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department Crime Lab in 1969. The laboratory at the time was facing a huge drug backlog. They needed chemists to do the testing. So that was how I got started in the field. I never planned on getting into forensic science. It's one of these things that just happened. In any event, I spent 40 years at the laboratory in various positions, and the last 20 of those as the laboratory director. As the person who introduced me mentioned, I've been involved with a considerable number of professional associations, the ASCLD, the American Society of Crime Lab Directors, the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, the IAFS, the International Association of Forensic Sciences, the IAI, the TF, the International Association of Toxicologists, and the International Association of Chiefs of Police. And the reason that I chose to belong to these various organizations was that as a lab manager, a director, I needed to have a good understanding of what was going on in the laboratory I managed, and to be able to contact colleagues and peers in other parts of the country and even in foreign countries to get their ideas about things that were going on. Along the way, I've written 3 books or co-wrote them. I guess the one that I'm most famous for is Techniques of Crime Scene Investigation, which I actually inherited from the publisher back at the 3rd edition. The original book was published by a couple of Swedish authors, and the original publisher wanted to update the book, and I was brought on. You'll notice in that book another Fisher as a co-author. That's my son David, who followed in his father's footsteps and is also a forensic scientist. And then a couple of other books along the way that I was able to get involved with. Should you wish to follow some of the things I've been talking about, I tweet at Barry A.J. Fisher, and I'm on LinkedIn. What I try to do is to publish press clippings and scientific studies that are interesting to me, and hopefully they will be of interest to other people as well. And if you choose to, you can certainly connect with me on these 2 platforms. I'd be happy to keep in touch with any of you who choose to do that. I have to confess to you that I am passionate about forensic science, and I believe it's an essential part of the criminal justice system. And probably the most important portion of it is the front end, that is collecting evidence for which the laboratory has to do testing on. So you can't really come up with any decent conclusions or reconstruction if the evidence is not collected properly. course, the father of modern forensic science is this fellow, a French forensic scientist by the name of Edmond Locard, who started off in the 19th century and passed in the middle of the 20th century. And he came up with the notion that every contact leaves a trace, and that's been referred to as the Locard exchange principle. And that pretty much holds that a perpetrator, a person that enters a crime scene, must leave something behind or take something away from the scene. And both of these things can be used as evidence. Of course, it is our job as crime scene investigators to locate that information and collect it properly and bring it to a laboratory for examination. I point this association. It's a very small American professional association, the Association of Crime Scene Reconstruction, and that's their website. If you choose, you can go online and check it out. They have a library of past meetings and some papers that you can take a look at. I'm not a member of it, but I did get invited to speak at one of their conferences, and I was very impressed with the quality of the things that they do. They have experienced crime scene investigators who do a decent job at crime scene reconstruction. So there are a couple of caveats or pointers before I get into the body of the talk that I'd like you to be aware of. The first is that crime scene investigation and crime scene reconstruction are collaborative efforts. No one person has all of the skills, knowledge, and abilities to fully take on all the work that's required to do this sort of thing, and you need to have a cadre of people that can help you out. However, the flip side of this is that there's a new concern about an issue called confirmation bias, which means that you have to be aware that people who come in contact with the evidence may in some way cause you to conclude some things that might not be reliable or relevant in a particular case. So, for example, if you're looking at evidence in a case and the detective in the case says, well, this person we arrested is, we're positive that he's involved in the case, and then you're looking at a very difficult fingerprint, latent fingerprint lift or a bullet comparison, you may be inclined to lean too much towards that individual's conclusion, and the result would be bias. So this is something that you need to be concerned about. There are a whole host of crime scene investigation tools that will help the investigator in his or her conclusions and subsequent crime scene reconstruction. Drones are becoming particularly important in taking photographs of crime scenes. This lower one over here of a traffic collision is an example of a nice overall view of what the crime scene looks like that can help in understanding what's going on. Another technology that's been around for a few years now is 3D laser scanning technology. This particular device here in the foreground is sold by Leica. There's another one that's available in the US and I imagine elsewhere by a company called Faro. And these are ways of using laser to pinpoint the location of various items at a crime scene. And if you're dealing with a particular complex scene, it's a very effective way of collecting data about where things are located and how they interact with one another. Here's an example of a scene. This is just lifted off of the internet. You can see how the measurements are put over some photographs at the scene, showing the location of various portions of the crime scene and how they all fit together. This is another example of what's going on. You can see the shooter over here, and what you can do is to translate and rotate the image around in 360 degrees and different aspects, so you can see what the shooter is seeing, get an idea of the trajectory, and also go from the victim of the crime and see get an idea of what he's seeing. And this is a good way of seeing what's going on. Bloodstain pattern analysis is another procedure that's used quite a bit to get an idea of the way in which the blood struck items. This is blood on the wall, and you can see it's moving in a downward direction. This would give the person familiar with bloodstain pattern interpretation an idea of how the relationship between the victim and various surfaces. There are a number of caveats that you should be aware of. You can consider them to be challenges, because if you're in an environment where the defense attorneys are becoming more skillful at asking difficult questions, you may find yourself facing some tough questions. Trajectory analyses may be something that you're called upon to explain and interpret, and you have to be aware, able to show the trier of fact the directionality of the way bullets were fired. Certainly traffic investigation by means of skid marks are another area that people are frequently called on to testify. And what happens is you're having to explain and justify how you come up with your conclusions to demonstrate your particular point of view on a given case. If the defense is pretty skillful, they might want to get involved in asking you questions about physics and automotive sciences and whatnot, and you have to be able to handle those questions. Bite mark identification is a problematic area. Here in the US, there have been a lot of cases that have been overturned after convictions through the Innocence Project, where forensic odontologists have claimed that a bite was made by a particular individual, but later DNA testing showed that the saliva present in the bite just did not come from that individual. So I'm not sure what the status in India is of something like bite mark bike mart information, but you may be faced with some challenges down the road in this particular area. Also, arson investigation has been up for question. There have been a number of cases where people who go out to fight fires claim to be skilled and trained arson investigators and subsequently found to be wrong in their assessment of what happened in a particular case. So what I'm trying to do is to give you some caveats, some warnings about things that may come on. There's another example of trying to use the various angles that bloodstain was made by piecing it together in a three-dimensional method, and these types of methods of identifying how a crime occurred are increasingly being questioned by the lawyers for the defense, and it's particularly important for the expert witness on the government side of the case to be able to articulate and explain how he came up with these conclusions and to demonstrate the reliability of what it is that he's doing. So now I have a few examples of crime scene reconstruction cases for you to take a look at. Mind you, these are just a very few examples, but you can get some idea of the variety of things that you may be faced with. This was an interesting situation. It was actually from a civil case that occurred as a result of a criminal case, and the question was this negligence or an accident? A police officer was involved he was in a convenience store, a shop that was in the process of being held up by a gunman. The police officer announced himself as a cop, and a shootout transpired. The police shot and killed the perpetrator, and unfortunately a innocent bystander was also killed in this particular case. And the plaintiff in this case, as I said, this was a civil case. They were trying to show that the officer acted negligently, wanted to show that he fired indiscriminately and struck the victim, the witness who was in the store. And what we observed was that this is a hollow point 38 caliber bullet, copper jacketed, and in the
Mr. Bhaskar Saha, please switch off your mic, please.
So what we have here is a hollow point.
Mr. Bhaskar Saha. Hello, Mr. Bhaskar Saha. Yeah, thank you. Sir, please.
What we have here is a hollow point bullet, and it managed to pick up some fabric in the indentation here. And when the fabric was carefully removed, we found the sequence of events to show how the bullet struck first the shooter, the perpetrator of the crime, and went through the shooter and unfortunately struck the innocent bystanders. So it was used to show the court how this case, how this crime actually occurred. This is an example of a burglary case. There was some debris, a piece of wood picked up on a burglary tool, and in investigating the crime scene, we noted that the area that had been burgled had been painted several times, and this is an end-wide sideways view, and you could see the multi-layers. It's kind of like a sandwich of all the different paints that were included, that were found here, and we were able to show that this came from this particularly unique source, and not some other thing that just had the outside color. This was a particularly interesting case. A body was found in the backyard. A person bought a house, and they were doing some work in the backyard to break up a concrete area in the backyard, and they broke through the concrete, and they found a dead body, actually skeletal remains, buried underneath this concrete walkway. And it turned out that the body was put into this makeshift grave, and cement was poured over the body, and it made a death mask in the inside of the cement. And when some molding material was poured into the death mask and was carefully removed, the coroner was able to get a representation of the dead person in this mold. What was even more curious was that the individual's hand was also encased in cement, and the quality of the cement was fine enough to actually get friction ridge on the fingers of this mold. In addition to that, there was debris found in the burial, which was identified as cigarette package wrapping, and it was an unusual color, which was traced back to a particular time, a period of about a year, when this occurred. The mold of the face was used to make a drawing of the crime victim of this case. It was published in the newspapers, and eventually somebody came forward saying that they recognized the person and that she used to live at this particular residence at the time when the crime occurred. Unfortunately, when the police put it all together, this was many years after the crime happened. The person who had committed the crime was deceased, and there was nothing to be done for the authorities other than to make the identification and to demonstrate who committed this particular crime. This was an interesting case involving a structure. This is called a gall. It's a kind of like a little house that a mite or an insect builds at the end here of a plant leaf. This is what it looked like. A person was murdered and dumped out in an area, in a wooded area, just outside of Los Angeles, city of Los Angeles. And in conducting a crime scene investigation, a sharp-eyed forensic scientist noted that there was one of these tiny little leaves that was present in the armrest, the area where a driver would rest his elbow while driving a car. It was caught in the junction between the rest and the panel of the door. And to the crime scene, the forensic scientist's credit, she noted that this was something she had never actually seen before, and she started to do her own investigation, and that ultimately led her to a university that was able to identify this particular structure, this gall, as the house of a particular mite, plant mite. And what was particularly interesting is that the professor who identified this insect was able to testify that that insect only lived at a particular altitude in a hilly wooded area in a particular direction because it needed sun to warm up the area. And it turned out to be the exact area that the person's body had been dumped at. And this particular piece of information was instrumental in a conviction of murder. This is a case that I reported on in my textbook. This was from some colleagues in Sweden. A car was found in the abandoned on the side of the road. The police came and they found a young woman who was raped and murdered, dumped on the side of the road. The police came, removed the body, and collected the clothing, and careful examination of the clothing revealed a bunch of fibers on the clothes. Through a good amount of investigation, they identified a car which had an interesting back seat, which the fibers over here matched some of the fibers of the on the individual. But what was equally interesting is that they also noted some other fibers that were not present from the vehicle, but were similar to the fabric found in this throw, this comforter, this blanket that was in the home of the suspect. So this was like a secondary transfer. The body was wrapped in this throw and deposited into the backseat of the car. They picked up the fibers from the blanket as well as the back seat, and this was helpful in getting the circumstances, the scenario of how the crime occurred. And speaking of cross contamination, I throw in this picture I lifted from the internet of a vehicle used for transporting bodies to or crime victim or victims to a hospital. There was a really an interesting case that was reported here a year or two ago in the literature, in which a suspect was accused of being a rapist because they found blood that matched the crime victim, and he said no, he had no contact with the crime victim. They eventually the police and the forensic people eventually were able to show that the original suspect actually had nothing to do with the crime, but picked it up from the gurney that was used to transport the rape victim to the hospital. So this is just a caveat that you need to be careful in terms of what your conclusions are. There may be some other interpretation that's available. Back in the middle 80s, we were faced with a really serious series of murders conducted by this fellow by the name of Richard Ramirez, who the press, who always liked to come up with an interesting name for criminals, they called him the Night Stalker. And we started to get called out to a series of murders in and around Los Angeles. This is just some of the things that we noticed. There was a pentagram put on the wall with some lipstick. This particular guy was into Satan worship, and this was one of the symbols that he liked to use. He put it on the leg of one of his victims. Outside of the this particular residence, they found an interesting shoe print. We had some of our lab people go around. We identified the shoe print as a particular a shoe that was in limited production and sold in Los Angeles. We could approximate the size of the shoe. We went to the manufacturer to try to find out if we could limit where the shoe is purchased. Sadly, that was a dead end, but this particular evidence became useless because this crime spree went up north to the San Francisco Bay Area, and sadly, the mayor at the time in San Francisco told the press that they had some really important evidence of a shoe print that was found at a number of these crime scenes, and you can guess that that was the last time we ever saw those sneakers again. So that's a reason why the police try not to give out very much information or hold it back from the news media. Through a series of a lot of legwork on the part of the police and forensic laboratories in a few locations, they eventually located some of this this evidence in a locker at a bus depot. Some of these bullets were worked through the mechanism of a gun, and they picked up some of the characteristics. We were able to take bullets from a couple of the crime victims and piece it together, and we also found some fingerprints from a vehicle that this fellow stole, and we were able to identify it. This particular fingerprint was the very first fingerprint that was
Mr. Ashok Dubey and Mr. Kailash Pawar, please off your videos, please.
these this latent fingerprint was the very first crime scene print that was identified by means of the state's AFIS, or Automated Fingerprint Identification System. This was a photograph after Mr. Ramirez was convicted. You can see he had a pentagram in his hand. He was sentenced to, I think it was 9 or 10 murders. He eventually died in prison of cancer. So now these are some other folks that we've dealt with. This was a murder case that occurred over a period in Southern California of nearly 30 years. This person was thought to be responsible for at least 1,000 murder, mostly rapes, but also a bunch of murders. He was convicted of 10 murders. And the way that the police ultimately got to him was through familial DNA testing. This was, at the time, one of the first instances where the forensic people and the police used familial DNA from the national database to identify an individual. They got DNA evidence from a number of rapes and rape murders. They ran it through the system, and they found a handful of individuals that might be related to this individual. The police started to check out these people, and they thought that this particular fellow, Mr. Franklin, might be the person involved. They went into a pizzeria and collected some soda cup and some uneaten pieces of pizza to take back to the laboratory to do some DNA testing. And bottom line was that they were able to demonstrate through DNA that this was the person who was responsible for this particular crime. And as I said, this was one of the earlier ones with involving familial DNA testing. This is another familial success story, but it goes beyond just the state's DNA database. This fellow who is called the Golden State Killer. Golden State is the nickname for California. He was responsible for a period over many, many years of multiple murders and at least 50 rape cases. And his DNA was similarly not in the state's database, and they tried to do the same sort of testing that they did before, but this time they did it a little differently. They used commercially available DNA tests companies where people would take a saliva sample and send it in to get a genealogical chart of people related to them. This person was tested using one of these commercially available tests, And the police were able to narrow it down to about 20 people who all had the same great, great, great grandfather. They further were able to narrow down this group of people to two, and then finally one who turned out to be this guy, Mr. DeAngelo. DeAngelo turned out to be a police officer while he was much younger and committing a bunch of these crimes. So that was another interesting case. So now we're going to move into question and answers, and I wanted to thank you for your kind attention. And let me get out of this screen sharing portion, and we can.
Okay, so we are open for the question and answers. If anybody have a question, they can ask sir directly the questions. Sir, we have some questions in the chat box. If you permit, I'll just ask on their behalf.
Okay.
Yeah. So there is one question by Raminder Singh. He is asking that when the forensic personals come into operation to collect the evidences or investigation in the crime scene in America. So I think he is asking about like how the forensic professional come into operation to collect the evidences and investigation in your country.
Okay. In the United States, there are approximately 17,000 police departments at the national, state, and local area. It's very, very diverse. These forensic laboratories may be part of the police department. They could be part of the prosecutor's office. They may be part of the medical examiner's office, or they may be even a separate independent department within local government. Depending how the authorities set it up, in some cases you may see a forensic scientist going to the crime scene. In my former laboratory, we would send forensic scientists to the very serious crimes like murder cases and arson cases and occasional rape cases. And then we would have a cadre of people who we would be designated as crime scene investigators who we go out to the lesser serious crimes and typically just collect fingerprints and photograph the crime scene. All of this evidence would be brought back to the laboratory, and then depending on the nature of the evidence, assigned to a particular portion of the laboratory for an individual to examine. So it's difficult to give you one clear picture of how it's done in the U.S. If it's a federal case and the FBI is involved, they have a whole series of individuals that are spread around the country called evidence response teams. If it's a really, really big case, like, for example, a terrorist case like the World Trade Center, you may have multiple agencies, the federal agencies as well as local agencies working together collaboratively to try to collect all the evidence that's involved.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Sir, there is one other question from Mr. Gautam Roy. He is asking about, is there any formula when somebody committing suicide regarding fall, push, and self-jumping?
Not that I'm aware of. Um, we had a case involving a person that either fell or was pushed out of I think it was the sixth floor of a hotel. And the question was, could we ascertain how this happened? And we wound up using some mannequins to try to reenact the situation to try to understand how this may have happened. We brought in some engineers to examine the scene and how the dummies fell. We had stop motion photography to examine how these things fell down the side of the building and to see if there was any touching of the wall, to see if there was any kind of scraping or bruising. The whole experiment was rather unsuccessful. We were not able to definitively answer that kind of question, but it's something that does come up from time to time, and you may want to find an engineer or even a physicist to take a look at how that's done. It's a very complex situation because often the body is going to be tumbling and could be difficult to try to figure out what transpired.
Okay, thank you, sir. There is another questions from YouTube from a participant watching your session live on the YouTube. He or she is asking that how to reconstruct a crime scene if it has occurred in a swimming pool.
I didn't catch the end of it. That occurred where?
How to reconstruct a scene of crime if it has occurred in a swimming pool.
In a swimming pool.
Very
Yeah,
innovative.
there are individuals that get involved with underwater crime scene investigations. I've seen programs that train people how to do this, laying out a grid under the water. You typically will bring in some people with scuba diving gear and try to understand what's going on. It's a very narrow and specialized field, but there are some individuals that do this. Myself, I have virtually no experience here other than I probably can go out and find somebody who has that expertise.
Thank you, sir. Another question from YouTube. What is familial DNA? Sir, can you give a brief explanation about that?
Okay, familial DNA. We all inherit DNA from our mother and our father, and if you look at DNA from a brother or sister or say a first cousin or grandparent, you will see certain similarities between you and that other individual, and that's what familial DNA is all about. It tries to compare some of these areas on the DNA genome with that individual. It's not able to definitively say that a particular person committed a crime. However, it's information that can help the police in narrowing down the field of people that they're interested in. It's gained a great deal of popularity here in the U.S. In cases where it's not possible to get a direct match from the state or the national DNA database, and they have to rely in other areas.
Okay, thank you, sir. Another question from Mr. Apu Ghosh. He is saying that in India, the crime scenes are not protected till the first arriving officer arrives at the scene of crime. So, what will be the probability to meet the principle of Locard exchange or a Locard principle at that particular case?
Well, that's typically the situation anywhere. The CSI, the crime scene investigators, the forensic investigators are never going to be the first ones at the crime scene. Typically, the police will first arrive, oftentimes a uniformed officer, and then they will call out some investigator to look at the crime. You may have the medical examiner or coroner's office there. You may also have somebody from the prosecutor's office present. And somewhere along the line, the people who are responsible for collecting evidence will show up. And the name of the game is to have people sufficiently trained so they know what to do and not mess up the crime scene until somebody who is trained and experienced can begin to properly examine that crime scene. I've seen many examples. I remember we had a particularly brutal murder at a movie theater. A person came in and murdered 4 people after the theater closed, and it was a case that in a small police department that had never seen anything like it, and they brought everybody who was on duty from the force to come in and look through the crime scene, and everybody was stomping through and touching things and whatnot. Bottom line was that they really mucked it up, and sometimes there's no way to save whatever evidence may have been there.
Okay. Sir, we have another series of questions. If you permit, then I can go with the further questions.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So next question is of Mr. Bhaskar Saha. He is asking that what sequence should we follow or the investigating officer follow for the reconstruction of the scene of crime?
Well, once all the information is collected, you want to assemble it in some sort of logical fashion. You want to get the photographs, the crime scene drawings, any videotaping that was done, and observe, look at all of that, and see if you can come up with a way of piecing together a logical story by means of the descriptive evidence and any of the physical evidence that was found, such as fingerprints or blood spatter, to see how that matches up with some of your theories of the case. And you want to be careful not to tie yourself down into one particular way this crime may have happened, and not allow the possibility of other ways of this happening to occur. It's really based on your a certain degree of logic and understanding about the evidence collected at a crime scene and putting it together in some sort of systematic kind of way. I don't know that I would suggest that there is one and only one way of doing it. It often will come down to what makes sense to the person doing that, and you might want to have a second person working with you to discuss possibilities of how the crime occurred.
Okay. Next question by Mr. Vichar Mishra. He's asking to emphasize on how forensic people work in remote areas or the rural areas where the digital technologies and still basic facilities are not available.
Well, sometimes you just have to go back to very basic things and use the tools that you have available. A number of years ago, I did I worked with the United Nations of the UNODC to develop a training manual for developing countries that tried to address that very question. How do you assist people who have very limited equipment capabilities to conduct an adequate crime scene? If you don't have some of this high-tech procedures to do digital crime scene photography, you just go back to some of the earlier methods, which are probably much easier to use, like cut film. Fingerprints are very easy to collect with some basic kits, collecting footprints, entire impressions by means of different types of casting media are things that you can do. And basically you have to try to do as best as you can and try to be flexible and adapt. I don't want you to be in a position where you just throw up your hands and say, well, I don't have the tools to do this, so we're just going to let this crime go unexamined.
Okay. Next question from Ms. Neha. She's asking that since forensic evidence are crucial at any crime scene, is there any authority or association which can keep the record of all these evidences to maintain its accuracy and to prevent it from manipulation?
Well, that's typically going to be the principal investigative authority. In our situation in the States, it would be the police that would be responsible for maintaining custody of the evidence until it goes to trial. Once it is admitted into evidence, then it's the responsibility of the court to keep and maintain all of that evidence. At least in California, I don't know what happens in other states because of the effectiveness of biological evidence through DNA testing. There are state law that all biological evidence has to be stored and maintained indefinitely. And I'm not sure what they mean by indefinitely, but I suspect I'll take the typical meaning forever in case information comes up at a later time where there are other technologies that can be used. When DNA first got started, it was a fairly primitive way of doing things, very time consuming, and over time it became more robust and more sensitive, and it's something that continues to be evolve. Today there's a big push in the States to do rapid DNA testing out in the field where there are companies are developing kits for the police to actually do the DNA testing right there at the crime scene and get a result in, say, a half hour. So.
Okay. Next question, sir, from Mr. Ashok Dubey, which says that which steps must be taken in India to eradicate this type of I think he is mentioning about the crime which are considered here heinous. What are the steps to be taken in India to eradicate such kind of crimes and which are considered heinous in India?
What kind of crime are you trying to eradicate? I didn't get that.
Mr. Ashok Dubey, are you here in the meeting? Actually, sir, his question is not clear. So I'm just asking him if it is here, he can directly question you regarding that. Okay, we can switch to another question, sir. I think he's not here. Another question from Chetali Goswami. She's saying that, sir, could you please tell that if in your country, the forensic science team and the medical practitioners, how doctors and these forensic science team interact with each other regarding the cases? And do doctors also visit the crime scene?
It depends on the region. Some places there is a very good close cooperation, and in other cases they barely speak to one another. It's kind of remarkable, actually. Um, Ideally, we hope they would work together. In many police departments, the detectives who are working on the case, say I'll use the example of a homicide. The detectives will often be present at the autopsy, and in some cases, the forensic science people from the forensic laboratory will also be there at the autopsy to collaborate with the pathologist conducting that examination. Um, it's it's all over the map. Some places there's a really close cooperation between the various players, and other places it's well, I'll just say it. It's shameful that there's not enough cooperation.
Another question, sir. I hope, sir, I can continue with the questions. Is it fine?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, sir. Dr. Vikrant Singh Thakur have asked that how to investigate and reconstruct a case in which a decomposed body is dumped somewhere.
Well, I guess it would depend on the extent of the decomposition and what the rest of the crime scene looks like. If it's something, if it's a body that's been buried and you're excavating that body, you probably want to bring in a forensic anthropologist to help with the examination of the bones. You want to be careful to collect any scraps of clothing and bits of identification. If the body is in a really bad decomposition and is putrefying, then that's a whole host of other issues where you hope that your mortuary facility has a place to handle that kind of investigation. I was at one crime scene a few years ago where this guy murdered his wife and put her into a plastic trash container and rolled the container into the garage, and never had the courage, I guess, to move the body to get rid of it. And eventually neighbors started to complain about the odor, and we went out to the crime scene, and when we opened up the garage, the smell was overpowering, and the contents of the body was basically soup. It had really badly deteriorated, and you just have to be prepared for any sort of situation with personal protective equipment for you and the police that are involved in it. You have to map out the area, how big is the crime scene that you want to be searching and looking for other materials. If you have a case where animals may have been involved and drug pieces of the body to different areas of the scene, and there may be pieces of fabric and whatnot, there's a lot of things to be considered to try to figure out what to do. Is it indoors or outdoors? What season of the year? What kind of weather conditions you have, and so on and so forth.
Okay. Thank you, sir. The next question is from Mahima Maru. In some cases, the evidences are planted to distract us. How can we isolate or find out them?
Well, I've seen cases where it's been falsified crime scenes to try to lead the police into a different direction. It largely comes down to experience and a certain amount of common sense. Does this information, what we're seeing, does it belong here? Does it make sense? How did it get here? Are there other ways that it could have gotten here? Might it have been placed to confuse us? It's a good question, and something that people who conduct these kinds of cases need to be aware of. And it really comes down to a level of experience, and hopefully you'll have a more senior person with you at a crime scene to give some guidance and perhaps some wisdom in how to proceed.
Okay, thank you, sir. Next question is from Mr. Vivek Jeswar on Facebook. He's asking that as per forensic analysis, in cases of bone marrow transplant, how can DNA profiling can establish if he or she is if he is a culprit or a suspect?
You're getting to the point where you're pushing the extent of my expertise. I know that we've had some cases where it wasn't bone marrow transplant, but it was a regular blood transfusion, and sometimes you see a mixture of multiple types of DNA present. There have been cases of something called chimera DNA, where you harvest DNA from different parts of the body, from different organs, and you come up with different DNA typing, and then you have to kind of scratch your head and figure out how this may have occurred, and ask those questions of the family member and the doctors that are involved. The bottom line is, I don't know the actual answer to the question, but it's a fair one.
Thank you, sir. Next question from Mr. Mudit Singh. Do forensic psychologists accompany the investigation team during crime scene investigation in US?
Typically, no. I know I once was involved with helping a forensic psychiatry resident in a program at a local university connect with a homicide detective who had some experience in trying to determine the person's state of mind. And they worked together for a couple of years, and it was a very worthwhile collaboration between the two of them, because in this case it was a psychiatrist, not a psychologist, but could be either one, to sit in with the interrogation and to add his or her expertise into the case. But to answer the question, that's something that's extremely rare, probably not a bad thing to do, but you'd have to get authorization or permission from the police and the investigator who's conducting the crime to be able to form that kind of collaboration.
Okay, sir. Thank you. The next question is from Miss Daisy on YouTube. How far touch DNA obtained in the crime scene act as a viable evidence in the court of law?
Try that again.
How far the touch DNA obtained in the crime scene act as a viable evidence in the court of law?
Okay, touch DNA is used. It's usually low amounts, very small amounts of DNA. For example, if to describe it, if somebody had been in a vehicle, stolen a vehicle, and handled the steering wheel or the mirrors, they could be swabbed and used to type the DNA. It has been used. In some cases, it's been questioned a great deal by the defense attorneys. It takes around the same amount of time as normal DNA testing, and I think it has some value, but it also, because of the low concentration, it's up for some degree of interpretation.
Okay, thank you, sir. Now looking into your clock at your place. So we'll take a last question for now. As there are many other questions which still remain unanswered, they can contact afterwards. They can have an interaction with you. The next and the last question is: what kind of evidence will get in case of sniper assassination of a person? In cases of sniper assassination, only bullet will be there as an evidence and no other evidences. So what kind of other evidences we can go for in sniper assassination?
Well, in addition to the firearms evidence, where to look at the striations on the bullet and compare it with a gun that may be collected later on, or to decide the make or the model of the gun used. You know, some guns have a left-hand twist and others have a right-hand twist, and by looking at the bullet that's recovered from the crime scene, you can come up, narrow down the firearm used. You might be able to come up with some information about the trajectory of where the shot was taken from. It's limited evidence, but it's something that may help in the investigation.
Okay, so Mr. Fisher, thank you so much for an amazing lecture. The week could not have been started on such a better note. I must mention my deep sense of gratitude to have accepted my invitation to speak from our platform, and to have brought along your years of experience, which for us was like visiting one of the best forensic libraries of the world. I must acknowledge that the case studies that you have discussed were highly appreciable and highly insightful about power and value of forensics in difficult case scenarios. Please accept my thankfulness on behalf of our GFSU family, and also my personal gratefulness for our
interaction since several days and working on it to make it possible today. Thank you so much. Good night for you. Jai Hind.
Well,
Thank you, sir.
it was a pleasure to join you today, and it's always good to work with colleagues around the world to try to enhance this field. I think we do some very important work in the justice field, and we ultimately it's an effort to make the world a little bit better than it is right now. So with that, I thank you very much for your time spent with me today, and have a good day. And who knows, our paths may cross sometime.
Yes, sir. Surely. Thank you.
So I thank all the participants for sparing your valuable time and have attended the session, which is, I think, very much informative for everyone. I would like to like everybody to open their videos now, and we can have a screenshot of our conversation with Sir. I hope, Sir, it will take only 5 minutes. Sir, we'll have a screenshot
Not
for this.
worry, it's only a couple minutes before 11 p.m. It's not quite
So
my
we are on
bedtime
time.
yet.
We
So
are
we
on
are on
time, so
time.
it's good. We are 35 minutes more with the actual scheduling of the lecture.
Right.
Ramya, can you take a screenshot, please?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
I think he's done.
Yes, ma'am. We are good to go.
Yeah. Okay. Good to go, sir. Thank you so much. This is Dr.
Okay.
Pooja here, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye bye, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you.